Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today, this evening. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our program tonight. A special welcome to our very special guest tonight, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and to the always wonderful Larry Mantle. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lehrer, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. Remember, we have no control over Eventbrite's registration process, but if you need help, just email me. You know I will ensure that you are registered and get the link. Next week, we welcome the award-winning journalist and author, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. He is the winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He was a finalist 7 times as well. He writes about human rights, women's rights, global affairs, health, and lots more, considered a revolutionary figure in opinion journalism. He will be in conversation with the always wonderful with Pat Morrison. The following week, we welcome the brilliant former acting Solicitor General of the United States, Neil Katyal, who has argued a record number of cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, most of which within the last several years. He will shed light on law and democracy and where we are headed in conversation with Warren Olney. This is a special week, not only because it is the very important Jewish holiday of Shavuot, which marks the giving of the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, and we wish everybody who celebrates a wonderful holiday. But it's also special because one member of our leadership team, our own Zev Yaroslavsky, has written a powerful memoir, Zev's Los Angeles from Boyle Heights to the Halls of Power. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass calls the book a compelling history of our city's last half century, as conveyed through the life of one of our most impactful leaders. This important history that Zev wrote charts the journey of a young social activist who battled to free Soviet Jews before becoming one of the most consequential elected officials in Southern California. It will be released next week and can be pre-ordered now. We will post information on how to do so at the end of tonight's program. The book, while it is LA-centric in some ways, it's much more generic in others about the story of his family, and it's a big city story about politics and the battles that happen in any large city. So I'm sure you will all enjoy reading that book. Zev is one of our own, and we are very proud of him, of what he's accomplished, and of the book, and you'll hear more about it in the weeks ahead. And a link to Zev's book will also be put in the chat, and it will be in the email we send after the program. Congratulations to Zev. Now for a couple more announcements, my friend and colleague, David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have the governor of a key battleground state with us this evening to explore how she earns such amazing buzz across the country. She has managed to turn Michigan, a highly contested state, into one where her party controls the offices of governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, and both chambers of the state legislature. We can be certain that Larry Mantle will find out what the secret sauce is that the governor has brought to Lansing. After the programs that Janice just mentioned, on June 14th, we'll bring back one of our favorites, the Washington Post's highly regarded columnist, author, and expert on Russia and military affairs, Max Boot. Max is always forthright and decisive, and should be especially so since he has just returned from a visit to the Ukraine. The following week, we will again host Peter Bacon, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Having been a correspondent in Russia for several years, Peter can discuss headline-making domestic and foreign affairs with equal facility and knowledge. He'll be in dialogue with tonight's host, Larry Mantle. Larry is a highly honored broadcaster who has hosted the flagship program NPR station, LAist, formerly KPCC, for nearly 40 years. His broadcast, Air Talk, was selected as the best public radio talk show in the nation by the Public Radio and News Directors of America. He's always probing, thoughtful, and fair. Larry?
David, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be with you for these America to Crossroads programs. And thank you as well, Mel and Zev. And for those of you that really want to get deeper into Zev Yaroslavsky's story, if you're in Southern California, I invite you to join us for Air Talk, the program that I host Tuesday morning, right after the Memorial Day weekend, as Zev will be a guest with me for an extended conversation about his memoir. For those of you outside of the Southern California listening area, Air Talk, the show is available as a podcast wherever you get your audio, Spotify, iTunes, anywhere else you'll be able to find our program. Well, this evening on America to Crossroads, as you know, we welcome Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a lifelong Michigan resident whose parents were both for a time worked in government. Governor Whitmer served in both houses of Michigan's legislature before being termed out. She defeated the Republican nominee and state attorney general to win the governorship in 2018. She was reelected last year by an 11-point margin over her Republican challenger. It was a year, of course, where Republicans narrowly took the House, but didn't enjoy the success that they'd hoped for in most swing states. Michigan, a prime example of a state where former President Trump lost support and Democrats picked up support from suburban white voters. And we'll be talking with Governor Whitmer about what fueled that shift. Welcome, Governor, to America to Crossroads. Great to talk with you this evening.
Thank you, Larry. I'm glad to be with you. And thank you, everyone, for giving me some of your time this evening.
As we're watching these debt ceiling talks in DC and federal legislation generally, bipartisanship is very tough to come by in 2023. It's of no value to Democrats in California, where the party holds a supermajority. They don't even have to deal with Republicans here. But to what degree is bipartisanship important to your leadership of a divided state?
Well, it's really important, Larry. So you mentioned my parents in the intro. Both my folks were public servants. My father was the commerce director here in Michigan when I was born. Republican governor was his boss who appointed him. And my mother was a longtime attorney for the attorney general, a Democrat attorney general. So I grew up in a household where we had a Democrat and a Republican at the table every night. And we knew that, I learned that if you lead from your values, it's a lot easier to find common ground with people. And Michigan is very much that same way. It's been really important to be mindful of making a seat at the table for everyone, including people you don't see eye to eye with. In fact, maybe sometimes that's an even more important seat to make sure you've got a robust understanding of any policies so that you can make the best decisions with the best information. But bipartisanship in Michigan is essential if you're going to be successful politically here, is what I've found over the years.
And let's talk about how you cultivate that, because as we know in DC, there's very little bipartisanship left. Even the social connections that members of Congress or the Senate have seemingly fallen by the wayside. And the polarity is greater than it's been certainly in our lifetimes. So in a state government, what are the ways that you are able to reach across the aisle to Republicans in your state legislative bodies? How do you do that?
It's interesting because I sat down with Josh Shapiro for a cup of coffee on Tuesday, the governor of Pennsylvania, and he was asking me something very similar because, of course, he's got a divided legislature and is struggling to find, opportunities to work to find common ground with his Republican branch of his state legislature. And, I told him one of the things that I've always done, which I modeled after Bill Milliken, Republican governor that I mentioned a minute ago, is holding regular meetings with the leadership of all four caucuses. So the majority and the minority caucuses in each branch of the Senate and the House. I do that every other week. Sometimes they don't show up. That's okay. I need to be able to tell the press I've made a seat at the table and I can open the door, but I can't make people walk through it. But more often than not, we have meetings. And, I think it might sound like it's common sense, but it bears repeating, especially in this current, environment with politics so polarizing. You cannot find common ground if you're not talking to each other. And even if you are talking to each other, it doesn't guarantee you find common ground. But the one guarantee is if you're not, you won't. And so that's been a real part of, I think, the success that I had my first term with a legislature that was downright mutinous at times, sharing stages with people that are now serving time for plotting to kidnap and kill me. But I had to keep getting to the table. I had to keep doing the best I could to get a budget done. I had bigger job at hand. And so prioritizing that and making it, a part of the regular routine, I thought was really, really important. It's not always fun, but it was essential.
Here in California, obviously, there are huge swaths of the state that are highly rural, but they're so minimally populated. The political power is really all in the cities of California and their suburban areas. But I wonder, in Michigan, is there more political power that's held in some of the more rural areas collectively? And do you have to be particularly attendant to rural Michigan residents?
Yes. So, we flipped both chambers of our legislature, but the majority is a 1-seat majority. So one of the things after the election, this was the first time Democrats have controlled everything in Michigan in 40 years. It's only happened 4 times in 130 years. And so I'm always very mindful that this is a slim majority. It's important that we live our values, but also that we continue to be strategic and win, and that means showing up. And so when I first ran for governor, I got into all 83 counties in Michigan. Michigan's a big state. I know California's a big state, but we have 2 peninsulas, and traveling the state, engaging with people, I learned a lot. And I also think that has helped me stay centered on what matters. And so, yes, we've got some population centers like Detroit and Grand Rapids, but we've got some up and coming areas like Traverse City, Michigan, which is more rural. It's a beautiful vacation town, but it's rural and it's traditionally more conservative. And that's why I think showing up and making sure that people know everyone is important.
And when you go to those areas, are you able to speak without people shouting you down? And so many elected officials now, if they're willing to go outside of areas that are their political strongholds, face tremendous rudeness and interruption from people.
Well, I had a very good relationship with my Republican legislature until the former president attacked me. And it changed everything for me here on the ground. It's when we started to see armed, the precursor to January 6th played out in the Michigan Capitol about 9 months earlier. It's when all the death threats started coming in. I'm walking and talking because I got to let these dogs out.
We all can relate to that.
I know. There they go. Kevin and Dougie are their names. Anyway.
Very good. Nice to meet you guys.
So, I had a very good working relationship with the legislature until Donald Trump singled me out, and everything changed after that. I love people. I do this work because I love people and I love this state. I genuinely want to learn what I can do to make people's lives better, whether they come from a population center or rural part of Michigan, whether they believe all the same things that I do or not. And I still engage in areas where I know I'm in the minority, but I have to be really strategic about it. It's different now because I do go out of my way to make sure I'm having the conversations with the farmers in rural Michigan. But it's a little different now. So I've not been shouted down like that. I don't want to tempt fate, so I'm going to knock wood.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I don't certainly want to belabor the issue of what you endured with the threat against you, because it's important that not define your term in office. But I do wonder if it changed you. A lot of people are scared off of going into politics now because they see, in an extreme case, the threat to you in lesser but still disturbing ways, the kinds of shouting down and threats and the kind of rancor that's directed at people in public office. So has it changed how you govern? And what would you say to those who this is scaring off?
It hasn't changed how I govern. I'm mindful and I'm keeping watch. So it's changed how I conduct myself, just in terms of Not what I say, not what I do, not how I treat people, but concern about people around me could be endangered because someone's targeting me. So it's changed a bit in that regard. I'm sorry, Larry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, and what you say to those who look at
Oh.
the examples of how people in public life are treated and say, you know, I'm not going to expose myself to that.
I think that's why accountability is so important. You know, the men who were plotting to kidnap and kill me, most of them have been convicted and they are now doing time. And the first round of prosecutions, 2 of the bit players got acquitted, and there was a hung jury on the 2 kind of masterminds. And I was so depressed when that happened. I mean, I really thought, gosh, if they can go to these lengths for a sitting governor, no one's safe. And they were retried and ultimately convicted. And I was so pleased, not because it's about me, but because we have to hold people accountable if we are going to change what we think is acceptable behavior in this country. And so I did think that it was an important outcome for where we are in this, this debate and this environment right now. And I would say to people who want to run. You know what? I can tell you the upsides of this job, even with all the craziness that I've had to endure and navigate, are so much more plentiful than the downsides. We have changed the world in Michigan. And that's happened because we, endured all the tough stuff, and we did it without losing focus on what mattered and without losing the grace that you have to have when you lead through these times.
And let's talk about the legislation, much of it bipartisan, which has been passed during your tenure as governor. What do you think have been the most substantial ones affecting the economy and quality of life for Michigan residents?
I will just focus on the first 100 days of this year. With my new legislature, we ushered through a $1 billion tax cut for working families and senior citizens. We expanded our Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to afford full protections in your workplace or in your home for the LGBTQ community. We killed the zombie law that was threatening to take Michigan back to 1931, banning abortion with no exceptions for rape or incest. We expanded workers' rights. We're the first state to do that in 70 years. And just yesterday, I signed extreme risk protection orders. A month before, I signed secure storage and background checks. And so as we see in some parts of this country where there are leaders who are vindictive and or trying to roll back rights, in Michigan, we're doing exactly the opposite. And it has had a real tangible impact on our economy, on the story that we tell, on our luring to try to attract young talent who expects a state to have all of these things in place. And so these fundamental rights are inextricably linked to the economy. And I think that's something that's really important that we can't lose sight of when we talk about how important this moment is.
In about 20 minutes or so, we'll be taking questions from our viewers. And I just want to remind you, you can put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please include, if you don't mind, your first name and your location. It's nice to have that along with your question to give a sense of place for all the people watching across the country. So again, please ask your questions, perhaps prompted by things that the governor has said to this point or topics that we haven't yet gotten to in our conversation with her. Governor, as Target and Anheuser-Busch have recently seen, there is a very deep divide over social issues, and both of those companies trying to deal with places where they were taking stands that were incorporating trans or generally LGBTQ themes into their retailing. As you look at a divided state like you have in Michigan and these social differences, is there a way that you can thread the needle through those, or do you feel any need to do that?
Well, I think, the key is how you talk about it, right? I am a progressive. I'm proud to be. I also govern a state that is very much, a swing state. And I respect that people have different vantage points, and that's why I always try to listen more than I talk. But I'm out and about because I want to really make sure that I don't lose focus of what matters or what's important to people. I believe that a woman should be able to make her own decisions about her body and her health care. I believe that every person should have full civil rights protections. I believe that our kids should have access to, historically accurate information and books about a variety of issues. I recognize that there are some people who think, I don't know anyone who's LGBT. This isn't my issue. It doesn't impact me. For those folks, I try to engage in a thoughtful dialogue about, if Michigan's not a welcoming place, how are we going to attract talent? And when we think about our economy, we need talent to drive and spur innovation and investment. And so that is a way that I have found is very productive in terms of bridging a conversation that some might say, oh, that's a social issue. I want to talk about the economy. They are linked. Toward the end of my campaign, we had a ballot initiative around choice here in Michigan. And I talked about abortion a lot on the trail. My opponent was radical, and I'm very clear on where I stand on the issue. And I've got a long fuse. I'm not quick to boil. I am patient. But it was toward the end of the campaign, and I got the same question over and over again, and I was a little maybe quick with my response. But I said, should you be talking about abortion so much? Shouldn't you be talking about the economy? And I said, if you don't think that abortion is about the economy, you probably don't have a uterus. Because the most important, profound economic decision a woman will make in her lifetime is when and whether or not to bear a child. So I think it's important to link them.
I was going to say, on the topic of abortion, I don't know what polling in Michigan shows, but national polling by Pew shows that the majority of Americans support access to abortion, but support for abortion, and I'm sure you're aware of these polls, shows that support after 14 weeks dropping, and you lose that majority support later in a pregnancy it goes. But there's very strong support for the exceptions that you mentioned earlier. Is there any room in Michigan for a compromise on access to abortion, or do you feel like it's really got to be full access throughout the pregnancy?
Well, Roe v. Wade was a compromise, right? It had limitations on viability, et cetera, and then permitted states to have additional policies that would create, I think, some limitations. And that's the current law in Michigan. So I would answer your question. Yes, there is room to have the conversation and to impose, some thoughtful, I think, parameters, which is what Roe v. Wade actually did. So yeah, I think what I struggle with is people who don't think women should have any choice completely misrepresent what the pro-choice position is and say, oh, they support abortion after birth. Like that's nonsensical in just the definition of what those words are strung together in one sentence. So I think that there's just been so much misinformation out there, but Roe was a compromise, and what we have on the law in Michigan is ensuring that women can make that decision, but there are limitations on that.
You've talked so much about this, and I know it goes back a decade, but it was such a powerful moment when you spoke on the floor of the legislature about your being sexually assaulted as a young woman, and how that related to the legislation that was being considered. And as you look back on that now and all that's transpired in the national arena about abortion, what are your thoughts about that, and how that message was received, your personal disclosure?
So, my whole time I was in the legislature, I was 6 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. And the whole time I was in the minority because Republicans controlled everything in Michigan for a long, long time. They were pushing through some anti-choice legislation that would have required that women pre-purchase a rider if they wanted any sort of abortion care to be covered by their insurance. So it was to pre-plan for an unplanned pregnancy or an unplanned complication with a desperately wanted pregnancy. It was nonsensical. It would create a complete barrier for a lot of women, but the legislature wouldn't even have a hearing on it and let women testify or doctors testify. They were running this without any notice. And I was trying to encourage one of my colleagues whose wife had just had an abortion. They desperately wanted to have a baby. They'd gone through IVF, but there was a malformation and it was never going to come to fruition. And so she had a procedure in a hospital, also known as an abortion, although people call it different things. I was trying to get him to tell the story and he just wasn't comfortable doing it. And I thought, if I'm asking him to bear himself to the world, I should be brave enough to do it. And I decided to share my story. It was on a whim. I didn't change a single vote in the House or in the Senate that day. I went home feeling incredibly depressed. I had to call my dad on the way home and tell him because I didn't want him to read this in the news. I wanted him to hear it from me because I'd never shared it with him. And woke up the next morning, but by the time I got into the office, hundreds of women and families and doctors had reached out to share similar stories. And I added my voice to a conversation that had started gaining speed in this country. And now we're in a much different place than we were at that time. But it was unplanned and unsuccessful in terms of impacting the vote, but I think incredibly powerful. And it was helpful for me to finally say it out loud.
And it had a significant impact. I would guess you still hear from people for whom that was very meaningful that you shared that.
I do. And, it's sadly too common in, something that plays out across this country all the time, but on campuses, which is how I experienced it, much more frequently than it should.
Let's talk about healthcare, because your father was a healthcare exec after his time working in government. He was, if I'm not mistaken, CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. And so you came up in that world of healthcare, and you are a Democrat who doesn't believe, at least at the statewide level, that a single payer plan is the way to go. And I wonder if you'd elaborate on the reasons behind that, because there are so many Democrats who would like to see that not only nationally, but with states that are willing to do it.
Well, I am a progressive, but I'm also a pragmatist. And I think that during my first campaign for governor, I had a very progressive record of which I was proud, but I had two people running in my primary who'd never run for office before, much less served, who were promising the world to get votes. And I'm not built that way. I'm not going to tell you I can do something when I know I can't do it. And so while I do think that our healthcare system doesn't work as well as it should, I also recognize that if we are going to have a single payer system or a better system than we have now, it's probably got to be driven by the federal level, that the states aren't going to be able to create unilaterally single payer systems. And so for better or worse, I could not say what my opponents were saying because they had no idea how to get it done because they couldn't get it done. And I wasn't going to tell people I'd do something I knew I wasn't going to be able to deliver on.
Well, our Governor Newsom in California, of course, said that he favored it. When the analysis was done on financially what would be involved, that changed after he became governor and saw what the price tag was. Do you think that the federal government should adopt a single payer program for healthcare?
I think that there are a lot of needs that we have as a nation when it comes to improving healthcare delivery, healthcare costs, healthcare access. So I don't profess to be an expert in this space. I was raised by a man who was, but I think that what we saw through the pandemic was that we've got real discrepancies in terms of what kind of quality, what kind of access, what kind of affordability different Americans confront as they confront our healthcare system, and the biases that are not a fault of, but a part of our healthcare system, that we've got work to do on all those fronts.
The GOP seems to have lost many suburban white voters, either as a backlash to former President Trump or with the abortion restrictions that Republican-dominated states have often pursued. And I wonder if former President Trump isn't the Republican nominee, do you think that those white suburban voters are potentially winnable again for the Republican Party? And what does that mean for Michigan?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I can tell you that the field thus far all subscribe to some form of Trumpism. There's not, maybe Asa Hutchinson's a little bit different, a little more critical of the philosophy, the Trump philosophy. But we've not seen someone who can stand on their own 2 feet and take it on and fight for democracy and say that the last election was a fair election and that Joe Biden is actually our president. There aren't people who will stand up and say, I'm going to fight for every American's rights, whether they're gay or straight or female or male or black or white. And so I think that if there was one, I don't know if they'd win in a primary, but if there was one, I think that they'd be much more, compelling and appealing to Michigan voters. The Republican Party in Michigan is very different. The DeVos family, well, the DeVos family used to control the Republican Party in Michigan. They funded it, they ran it. Betsy DeVos and her family, and her candidates all lost to radical Trump folks. And now the party is led by a woman who, just one quick example, she routinely says that Beyonce and yoga are both satanic. She's just unhinged. And so they're a bit of a mess here. And that's why I do think that more reasonable Republicans and thoughtful independents voted for me, with 11-point victory. They had to have. And I think that it's because there's not a viable, reasonable person on the other side. Now, all that being said, someone could come out, and I think Michigan could very much be in play.
Governor Newsom here in California is building his national brand with a very in-your-face challenge to Florida's governor, now presidential candidate as of this evening, Ron DeSantis. And that despite the fact here in California, we got some really serious problems with homelessness, lack of mental health resources, aging infrastructure. But Governor Newsom is really, taking this position of countering MAGA world. And I wonder for yourself, as you look to your political future, it seems like you're taking a little bit of a different approach. It's sort of like nuts and bolts, infrastructure, economy. And so I just wonder if you'd elaborate on that, because it's as successful as a governor is in running his state, it's always hard to get that national recognition and buy-in.
Well, I think, California is California and Michigan's Michigan and Kentucky's Kentucky, right? We're all Democratic governors. We all have very different situations that we are navigating. And I'll never, often during the abortion debate, I was being asked, should other governors have followed your lead and filed lawsuits as early as Michigan did? I said, other governors don't have all the same tools I have. And I'm never going to say what they should or shouldn't do. I can just tell you, here in Michigan, I've not been drawn into federal government because I like being close to the people that I serve. And you can see the impact of your work at the more local kind of state level. When I was on all the national news, it wasn't because I was looking to be on the national news. I was just desperately trying to get masks and gloves and swabs for my state in the middle of a pandemic. I'm grateful that I've had the opportunities that I've had, but the success that I've had is because I think I've been really tethered to, and I have to be as a Michigan governor, the nuts and bolts, as you put it, of running state government and rebuilding our state and leveling barriers that keep people from skills and other opportunities. And that's what I've done, and that's what I'm going to keep doing.
You've had your own setbacks that you've had to deal with. You actually brought about a bipartisan moment when you proposed that 45-cent per gallon gas tax, and people came together to say that's a terrible idea, Governor, and that got shelved. You also had a similar to Gavin Newsom moment during the height of the pandemic when you were out in a crowded restaurant, people were unmasked, and you were seen in that environment. What is your, when you step in it, so to speak, what do you see as your responsibility as governor to respond to that and to respond to criticism in places where perhaps you yourself think you've made a mistake?
I think to own up to it. I was raised in a household where if you screw up, you say I screwed up. We had gone out, it was, late in the pandemic, but we still were trying to limit how many people were at a table, and we were in a restaurant. There was no one else in there. We had a group, and we probably should have sat at 2 different tables, but someone pulled them together, and I didn't think it. It didn't dawn on me. And then someone posted it on Facebook, and immediately it was apparent that I'd screwed up. And I said, yes, that's me in the picture. I screwed up, and I'm vaccinated. I'm masked up, but when I make a mistake, I own it. And at the 45-cent gas tax, I think that's another good example. Like, I ran on fixing the damn roads. I heard from people all across the state. That's how people in Michigan were talking about the roads. I never in a million years dreamed I'd run on a slogan to fix the damn roads, but that's what we did. And when I wrote my first budget, I told people I'm going to do this. I'm going to put a real solution on the table. And my political people were like, oh my God, you're going to put a 45-cent gas tax out there. And
even your dog's upset hearing about it.
I know
again.
the dog doesn't like it either, but they rejected it. But I could get out and say, I did what I said I was going to do. I put a solution on the table. The legislature never came back. And so you can't blame me if the roads aren't all fixed. And obviously the public accepted that, because they sent me back here for another 4 years.
Have you found money elsewhere to be able to deal with the infrastructure? Because obviously, as you said, Michigan's a big state, and car and truck travel is essential to commerce in your state. Have you been able to do much without that tax?
I like how you say, have you found money? I've not found money, but with the ability to bond. So I pushed through a bond unilaterally. So we're getting some work done. It was actually a really shrewd way of bringing in some dollars and capitalizing on low interest rates and getting the work done. The infrastructure work that the Biden administration got done is enhancing what we are doing. But we do not have a long-term solution. And that's something that I've got to continue working on with my new legislature. I think we're all grappling with, how do we fund roads when we're moving so quickly from ICE to EVs? Because a gas tax ain't going to do it anymore. And so I guess we are unanimous. I'm glad we didn't get the gas tax done either.
It's just so interesting. All right. Again, we're taking questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please include your first name and your location. Jeffrey asked, do you think that the current overreaction about transgender people is going to pass?
I think that so we've been trying to amend our Civil Rights Act here in Michigan for 20 years. And we got very close one time, and I was the Senate minority leader. So I was the top Democrat, and the Senate majority leader, Republican, who I got along with pretty well, came up to me and said, Gretchen, we can move this civil rights protections and include lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, but trans is just a step too far. So we'll just leave the T for later. You know, this was him. And I said, so Randy, I think you're really underestimating this community. You clearly aren't familiar with the community and you don't know that that's never going to fly. And he said, you Democrats won't vote for half a loaf. You know, you're going to insist on tanking everything. And I said, Randy, the people that need the protections the most are the most vulnerable part of this community is the trans community. And he didn't know that and didn't appreciate that the rest of the community was going to wrap their arms around and all go together. And so I think that these attacks on trans people are just incredibly crafted to divide and scare the public, which is unfortunately so much of what political playbooks look like today. I don't think
Governor,
that in a year
sorry.
from now we'll be talking about the same thing. I just don't think so. We will have moved on to some other thing.
Governor John asks, some progressives in Congress seem to be disconnected from real life issues and people. How can your model be replicated elsewhere or on the national level?
Well, you know, I think what we did here in Michigan was stay focused on the fundamentals. You know, I always talk about the dinner table issues, and people in Michigan probably roll their eyes when I say it, but I mean it. When you, if someone can't put food on the table or they're worried about their child's safety, nothing else matters. And so we can't get distracted by things that aren't truly the fundamentals. And we can be progressive all day long, but you got to deliver, you got to get things done. There were a number of components, I think, to our success here. One is we got rid of gerrymandering. So we have a commission drawing districts for the first time in Michigan, which is why we were able to flip both chambers of our legislature, because it was actually every vote counted. We had abortion was on the ballot. We had a very well-resourced and coordinated effort from governor to every office, Secretary of State, Attorney General, House, Senate. Every statewide Democrat won this last year. And I think that it was the combination of those things were all played into the success that we had here.
And I just want to piggyback on what you just said. Jonathan in Laguna Woods in California asking about partisan gerrymandering in Michigan, and how did you deal with that?
So there was a group that came together called Voters Not Politicians, and it really was a grassroots organization. Eric Holder, Stacey Abrams, each contributed toward that effort in one way or another. They went to the voters, collected signatures to go on the ballot. And I know you guys have ballots that are even longer than Michigan's, but ours are always long because we can amend things by just collecting signatures and going straight to the people. Thankfully, over the last 40 years, Democrats would have never gotten anything done if we didn't have that right. But they went to the people and changed how districts were drawn. And it was a compelling story. It was a grassroots effort. We amended our Constitution in 2018. So when the census came around, we had a commission that was set up to draw these lines. We went from being in a super minority in the Senate to 6 years later being in the majority by one vote, but a much more reflective legislature, you know, in terms of what the population is too.
Now, is that commission a citizens commission, or is it appointed by members of the legislature? To what degree did those commission members have independence?
It's a citizens commission, but it is evenly distributed in a partisan way. So they're not politicians, they're not nominated by politicians, but they have some sort of a known affiliation.
Alan asks for your thoughts about West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin's efforts to be reelected in a very red state.
You know, I don't even know how to answer that other than the fact that someone like Andy Beshear wins in Kentucky when it's completely red, or Joe Manchin wins in West Virginia, even though everything else is completely red, or Sherrod Brown for that matter in Ohio. You know, as Democratic governors, frequently talk, sometimes people would be frustrated with messaging coming out of Washington, DC, and they'll say, when does Washington get their messaging right? And I would say, no governor is waiting for Washington to tell us how to talk to the people we serve. We are the best experts and we live it every single day. We breathe it. And so I'm not quite sure how to respond to a Joe Manchin question other than to say, I believe that he probably is a good reflection of the people he serves, as frustrating as that can be for a lot of us on some days.
Sid asks, is it important for politicians seeking to span the partisan divide to avoid very progressive or very conservative positions? And I'd amend just a little bit to Sid's question and ask, well, what if you had a Democratic supermajority like Gavin Newsom has in California? Would you still feel the same need to reach across party lines to your Republican constituents?
I think so, but I'm not sure. I've never known that that scenario. I really do think that we are at our best when we've got a diverse set of experiences, geography, socioeconomic, racial, religious. When we've got real representation around a table, we make better decisions. And so any tables that are dominated by one party, I think, is missing an important perspective. So I like to think that I would. Having never been confronted with that supermajority situation, I can't tell you for sure. I talked to my colleagues though, and I can tell you the ones that have all Democrats have issues. The ones who have no Democrats have issues. So in the pandemic, I organized some regular calls with my Midwestern counterparts. So Republican Mike DeWine from Ohio, to Tim Walz, Democrat from Minnesota, J.B. Pritzker and Tony Evers and Eric Holcomb. So it was a bipartisan group. And it was during those conversations that I felt better about my situation here, because every one of them was complaining about their legislature, but they had same parties fighting the fights that I was fighting across the aisle. So it was helpful perspective that there's always a tension between the executive branch and the legislative.
And we've seen that in California, even with a Democratic supermajority, there's factionalism with some Democrats who are more, for lack of a better term, pro-business, and others that are more labor aligned. And so even that issue plays out in California. Rich asks, how are race relations in Michigan these days?
So I feel very good about the work that we've done. I feel very good as we looked at a lot of the demonstrations in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and where some of them, became a lot scarier. We did not have that play out in Michigan. We had demonstrations for sure, and we had some that got a little out of control. But we largely were able to avoid the violence that I think many were bracing for. Some were, in a sick way, kind of hoping for. We didn't see that happen here in Michigan. My lieutenant governor is our state's first Black lieutenant governor. We now have the state's first Black Speaker of the House. We now have the first woman Senate Majority Leader. We've really changed, leadership in Michigan, and that's been a North Star, whether it was seeking equity in terms of healthcare during a pandemic that was disproportionately killing people of color, or it was addressing bias in healthcare, or all the appointments that I've made, from agencies to commissions to the bench. We've really diversified our ranks and leadership across the state. And I'm very proud of that. And I think that's maybe been a helpful thing as we've had to navigate a lot of tough stuff as a nation.
Cities have had a rough go in some urban cores through the pandemic. You're aware San Francisco's lost a tremendous amount of the workforce that was commuting into the downtown of the city, and they're dealing with challenges from that. Other major cities similarly. And I wonder, for Detroit and your other larger cities, what have you seen as the effects, and is there anything that state government is attempting to do to address any economic distress that lingers from the pandemic in urban areas?
Yeah, so, there's been so much progress in the city of Detroit. I was very proud when we hosted the Democratic presidential debate. It was one of the first ones. It was two nights because we had 17 or 18 candidates on the stage and they broke it into 2 nights. But it was so great to host and have people come into Detroit and just experience it and how it just smashed all of their assumptions about what Detroit is and what it looks like. It was just really cool to see that. Um, Detroit has made great strides. It is a phenomenal place. There's a lot of cutting edge industry growing in Detroit right now. We have historically funded schools by property taxes. And so you've got a wide discrepancy, and wealthy areas have much more resources to educate students and poorer areas have less. And it flies in the face of the science that tells you a child who is at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum needs more resources, not less. And so we actually changed how we fund schools and closed that gap to make them equal. And then we built equity on top by putting more resources in English language learners and kids with special needs. And so this is, I think, one of many different things that we have done to address kind of the racial disparities, whether it's in education or job opportunities or skills opportunities.
We have Marcia who asks, how is Flint doing in recovering from the drinking water crisis?
There's a lot of good stuff happening in Flint. And one of the lousiest things about winning election to governor is that your name gets replaced on all the lawsuits against your predecessors. So my predecessor, who was in office when the Flint water crisis happened, and it happened for a lot of decisions that came out of my predecessor's office. Now became the people of Flint versus Gretchen Whitmer, and that was terrible because I was, obviously horrified by what happened in the city. We've worked really hard. The pipes have all been replaced. We've put an incredible amount of resources into nutrition and wraparound supports for kids. But the toll of lead poisoning is real and it is lifelong. And we've got ongoing concerns about what it will mean for these young people's health. And if you don't have impulse control and you're an African-American driver, what might that mean for an interaction with the police that is already something to be concerned about, in this country? So there are ongoing needs, but we've made great strides and we're committed and working very closely with the community.
Speaking of police, one of the things, as you know, that jurisdictions all over the country are dealing with is a difficulty in hiring officers. There's tremendous attrition, and it's many people who might have considered in the past don't see it as a profession they want to pursue for multiple reasons, including the criticism that's gone to law enforcement generally. Is that an issue that you're dealing with in your cities and counties in Michigan, and how are you trying to address that?
I think we're all dealing with it to some extent or another. So, trying to raise pay for police officers and making sure that they've got the support that they need so that they can get back to policing. We call and ask our officers to respond to things for which they're not equipped, or to things that really needs a different type of expertise, a mental health crisis, for instance. We are building out additional mental health supports. And I think the whole world appreciates why that's important after the last couple of years, where we know so many people are struggling. If you're struggling pre-pandemic, it was worse. And if you weren't struggling, maybe you are now. It's been very difficult on us all. But I think that our police officers have unfairly been squeezed by a lack of financial support for a long time, with a growing population that is in distress and not having the ability to meet all those needs. So
are you able? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. We've put a lot more resources in. Yeah.
Are you able to hire those mental health professionals or train people for those mental health interactions? Because, again, yet another challenge California is facing is finding enough people willing to do the work and to commit to it longer term, because there's a tremendous churn rate in those jobs.
Yeah, they're hard jobs. I mean, and it takes special people to do them. We've worked really hard to level the financial barrier to getting skills in that field of expertise. We've put a lot more into mental health supports for kids in schools, from K through 12, real wraparound supports for our students. But there are a lot of adults who still need access. I think that telehealth has given us more ability to meet people's needs, but that's not going to solve the problem if we don't have enough experts who are counselors or social workers or psychologists. So we're putting resources and we're trying to lure people into it, but it is, I think, a universal need and issue that we're all grappling with.
I want to ask you a question that, the smart political response is to totally sidestep this, but I hope that you won't do that. I hope you'll answer honestly. If Joe Biden was to drop out of the presidential race for any reason, would you seriously consider mounting a run in this cycle? Again, if President Biden stepped away from his run.
It's a hard question to answer because I've made a commitment to the people of Michigan that I'll serve out this term and I will remain laser focused on Michigan. I asked them for a second term. They gave me the opportunity and I want to do the very best I can at this job and hope there will be other opportunities in the future. In that hypothetical, I don't even like thinking about it because the president has said he's running. He is got my full support. And so playing out a scenario that counts him out is not something I enjoy.
Okay, so what I'm hearing though in your response is 4 years hence, it sounds like you're ready to go.
You're putting words in my mouth. I said,
no, but I mean,
you
sounded like once you fulfilled your commitment to Michigan voters, and is that something you were seriously considering that 4 years from now, there's a very good chance that you'll run for president?
You know what, Larry, I don't know. And that's the honest, complete, unvarnished truth. When I was born, I never thought I'd run for anything. When I left the legislature, I thought I was done in public service. Now I'm governor in my second term. I love the people of my state. I love this country. If there's a role for me to play, that's always something I guess I'll be willing to explore. But if there are good people that I can help do the job, that's a role I'm willing to do as well.
Well, thank you. And we come to the conclusion, and I'd like to give you just a minute to wrap up and maybe include in that very brief comment sort of what you see as a potential model in Michigan that could be replicated by elected officials elsewhere. Well,
thank you for hosting me, and thank you. This was a fun exchange. I really appreciate it, Larry. I think one of the great takeaways from this last election is that we can make a difference. We saw it here in Michigan. A tremendous change happened here in a very short period of time under circumstances that no one would have ever imagined. They were writing my political obituary 14 months ago. And now I'm in a position where we control all branches of government in the state. I didn't know that was possible, but I can tell you that staying focused on the people and the fundamentals, making sure that we've got fair rules, and that's the redistricting piece, and living your values, but listening and making space for others to find your way. That is how majorities are built. We've done it here in Michigan, and it can be done elsewhere, but we all have to stay engaged, and we all have to roll up our sleeves and do the work together. And I thank you for giving me time tonight. And I thank those of you who supported me in this work for all of your help.
Governor Whitmer, thank you very much. And I have to say, I've really enjoyed this as well. I look forward to future conversations. You're joining us again on America at a Crossroads. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. And I want to say to those of you watching tonight, remember, this is a nonprofit presentation. We ask for your support for either of the two organizations, nonprofits that put on these important programs. You can go to the website of either Jews United for Democracy and Justice or Community Advocates, Inc., and make a tax-deductible contribution to support these programs. We sure appreciate you doing that. Now, next Wednesday, it's Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof talks with the beloved and much honored Los Angeles Times columnist Pat Morrison. The topic, Rays of Hope in a Grim Time. That's something we certainly need, and many of us will look forward to hearing. That's next Wednesday, May 31st, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern, for our next America at a Crossroads. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.